Welcome to a special virtual edition of the Skeptics track at Dragoncon, where we put the science in science fiction.
Good morning and welcome to our last day of Skeptic Track live streaming from Dragoncon 2020. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Dr. Angie. I'm the Assistant Director. Thank you to Calico Cove Productions for helping us produce this wonderful set of videos. And thank you to Mark Gura and Tara Heaton for joining us this morning. They're going to talk to us about how we should be skeptical of our brain. So, good morning.
Hey everyone. Great to be here with you.
Good to see you this early morning. I guess it's not that early, but it's early enough after Dragoncon on a Dragoncon Monday. So tell us about our brain and why we should be skeptical.
Okay, well, great. So Tara and I will talk today about the chemicals in our brain and how they override our will and rule our lives and what to do about that. So Shara is going to be flipping the slides for us. So Shara, if you want to go to the next one. So have you thought about this? Have you thought about who you are? I mean, we tend to define who we are as our body, our mental processes, our will, desires, likes, dislikes, and loves, our talents, and how we treat others. Some part of this definition usually includes some metric of our accomplishment or lack thereof. It includes the adversity that we've overcome or not. We might take into consideration what we own or don't own. We might even measure how happy we are or not, or how loved we are, or how we love others. These elements all seem to be self-created, right? Self-created attributes that come from within. But what if they come from outside of us? And if they do, if they come from outside of us, does that mean we don't have free will? So let's go to the next slide, share. So does your will come from sources internal to you, or are you shaped by external forces that make you who you are? So Tara will introduce us to brain chemicals that affect us, and she'll show us that our brain chemicals actually do and are dictated by our environment. And so then we're going to discuss how these external forces make us who we are. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Shara. So through this presentation, you'll notice that our desires, our will, can be affected by our personal susceptibility to our external influences, and that our brain chemicals are the agents that pull the trigger on shortcutting our free will. So doesn't this indicate that if we can override the power that's exerted over us by external influences, then we will have some semblance of free will? And if not, we do not have free will. So in other words, if external forces override our consent, there's no free will. But if we are able to assert our will on our subconscious processes, doesn't this mean that we might have some semblance of free will? So I'll talk about our ability to force our internal conscious will and aspirations on who we are. And I'll also talk about the techniques that influence these subconscious processes and how to utilize them. And we'll discuss whether these techniques give us power over our environment or not. And this begs another question. So what if some people refuse to utilize the techniques that give us this semblance of free will? Does this mean that only some people have free will and not other people? So Shara, if we go to the next slide. And so the other thing is, I just want to touch on what externals are. So this might be obvious, just making sure we're on the same page. So anything that comes from outside of us is an external. And since our DNA and bodies were apparently created outside of our conscious will and consent by forces that are external to us, does that make us externals? Does that make our very will external? Does that make our free will external to us? I mean, I say no because we're defined by our body. I mean, our body is still our body. It's still us. And for example, AI has no free will because it was designed to operate a certain way by by a creator, right? And if a human being is able to override her external conditioning and anything that controls her from the outside, then these decisions that we're making are coming from us, from the human, from internal to us. Whether they are conscious decisions or not, it's still coming from us. So our subconscious processes are still us. We just need to make sure that that our will is not being overridden by externals. So externals also include, anything external to us: pressures at work, at home, pleasurable and painful experiences, technology, media, people, other people, our environment, everything like that. So if we go to the next slide, so Tara will talk about the key neurotransmitters, those chemicals that affect us, that act as internal externals to us, and the ways that our brain is affected by these chemicals and overrides our free will. So I'm going to turn it over to Tara, and if we could go to the next slide, share.
You can go back to that other slide. We're good. We'll get to that in a minute. Thank you, Mark. I wanted to give just a little bit of background before I dive into these neurotransmitters, because I am certainly not a neurologist, although I have spent many, many years talking to neurologists. I was building a career, and still am, in sales and communication, and always looked at communication and as an art and as a sport. And something changed that, specifically on January 11th, 2005. On January 11th, 2005, I went upstairs to check on my 12-year-old daughter, who was perfectly healthy, but had what the CDC has termed a virus of unknown etiology. Well, I walked up the stairs on January 11th of 2005, and my daughter was unconscious. And I began to shake her and try to wake her up. And at that moment, she went into an epileptic seizure, the first that I'd ever seen. But today I've witnessed her have literally thousands of epileptic seizures. And she's 28 years old today. And we've mitigated these seizures. I've traveled all over the country, literally, even into Hawaii, looking to repair these seizures and stop them. And while they are less than they've ever been before, they have done significant damage to her brain over the years. So if you will go to the next slide, I'll tie this together now. That was January of 2005 when this kicked off. And toward the end of 2005, I sat with one of her first neurologists, and I asked the doctor if we could just take her off of the seizure medications because of what they were doing to her, all the terrible side effects. And the doctor told me no. She said her seizures travel across her hippocampus, and that's damaging her ability to learn, to remember, and to act naturally. So that day kicked off a almost 16-year now study of neuroscience, and specifically the way our brain functions and neurotransmitters. So I was coping with life with a lot of coffee and cigarettes. And I did not really understand anything about neurotransmitters, but my study did two things. It helped me to develop my platform, which is called Talk to the Brain, because we actually have the power to elevate the neurotransmitters that we crave when we speak to people in our audience, whether it's an audience of one or thousands. But this study also, and this is where we're going to focus today, this study also empowered me to finally overcome the way that I was responding to external stimulus. And one of the number one ways, you can go to the next slide, is something that most of us have certainly heard about, and that is the understanding of dopamine. Dopamine today is a very hot topic, mostly because of the internet. As social media and video games have really become popular, and the internet at large, and walking around with a cell phone, dopamine is highly addictive. And what people who don't study dopamine in detail think that it is, they think that it's pleasure, but it's not. Dopamine is intrigue, it's desire, it's the hope of what's to come. It's what keeps us alert and energized. It feels great, but it's highly addictive. So a great example of this was all those years ago. I didn't want people to know that I was a cigarette smoker. I could go all day long working super hard, and I would know that at the end of the day, I would be able to sit on my porch with my coffee and cigarette, and that would infuse dopamine in my brain, just thinking about the reward as to where I was going. And you can go on to the next slide.
So, Tara, if certain external objects and processes stimulate creation of dopamine in our brains, and thus a desire for more dopamine, are we being hooked to depend on these externals? I mean, if we're dependent on these externals, do these sources not manipulate our behavior, perhaps even our free will?
100%, especially when we're not aware of this information. But this knowledge is powerful because I was a dopamine addict, and so was my son. But now I am able to control how I experience life due to this knowledge.
So dopamine's like a fish hook. We're trapped by a line that's attached to the hook, and our behavior, our free will changes. It's controlled by whatever externals supplies us the dopamine, right? All because of our desire to get more hits of dopamine, right?
Absolutely. As I said, it's highly addictive. But now, Mark, you have studied for decades subconscious behavior. Share with us how that study really relates to the dopamine producing externals in our world.
So this is one of the most important questions that we can even consider. Either there are techniques that work to give us free will back, or humanity has no free will, and we are marionettes to external agents that trigger our brain. I mean, here's what I found. You know, we naturally feel anxiety, right? Stress, discontent, oftentimes seemingly for no reason. And we know that these sensations are caused by our neurotransmitters. And if we can naturally, internally, stimulate production of wanted neurotransmitters, we can produce wanted sensations, right? Or we can be dependent on these neurotransmitters being stimulated from our external environment. And if we do that, we're totally giving up our free will. So you've all heard, I'm sure, about the concept of neuroplasticity, right? It's the ability of the brain to change its neural networks through repetition. So repetition, thousands of repetitions, instills changes in the brain. And studies show that the neural networks do change with constant repetition. So the techniques that I'll be talking about in a second affect changes to our neural networks. They help us get our free will back. So if we could go to the next slide, Shara. So in the last 15 years, countless experiments have been conducted that show the following techniques change our brain chemistry and even the physical brain itself in positive ways. With repetition, the most powerful way to affect the brain is through altered states of consciousness. So that's an added layer of control that we have over the subconscious. So an altered state of consciousness is when we experience that feeling of being in the zone. When conscious activity lessens, it's that state where we remain conscious, but our consciousness is more relaxed. So if we go to the next slide, what happens is the brain receives about 11 million bits of information per second, but the intellect is only conscious of about 50 bits per second. The intellectual consciousness is our conscious will, our conscious awareness. That's what most of us usually think of as us in a very finite way. You know, we think our consciousness is us, but in reality, there's so many things happen on a subconscious level. And altered states of consciousness give us more access to that buried information, to those buried drives. And it's also the best way to affect neuroplasticity. It's like a deeper neuroplastic chisel. So next slide, please, Share. So the positive attributes of altered states of consciousness that happen in a very spontaneous way, because see, we enter into an altered state of consciousness spontaneously all the time. And it happens by accident. It happens when we're exercising, when we're watching a great movie, when we're walking through the forest, contemplating the universe, reading a great book, having great sex. It happens all the time. The negative part about doing it, entering an altered state unconsciously or spontaneously, is it leaves us open to being conditioned by our environment because we're not really screening the information that comes into us. So therefore, government agents, corporate entities, religious entities, the media, all these change agents have an external effect to our subconscious, and they make us who we are if we're not screening out and affecting our subconscious in a purposeful way. So if we could go to the next slide, Shira. Purposeful altered states of consciousness, in other words, meditation, allows us to rewire the brain through neuroplasticity according to our own desires. It frees us from unwanted instinctual reactions and limitations. It helps us to observe unconscious processes more clearly. It helps us to overwrite pessimism if that's what we want to do. It helps us to evaluate ways in which we have been affected by our cultural conditioning. And it aims our brain chemicals to help us achieve our goals. Now, the negative thing about meditation is it's not for everyone. Medically, some people shouldn't be meditating. Talk to your physician about this. And it takes time to learn to meditate, years and years, to do it properly, to do it well. And it takes effort. So if we could go to the next slide. So how do you utilize these techniques? Well, there's basically 4 induction ways that we utilize these techniques. And we can mix different ways of induction. I'm not going to go very deeply into it because I talk about this in my books and other seminars and stuff like that online and on paper a lot. So I'm just going to skim over it. But basically, we can enter these altered states through guided methods. So if somebody else is taking you into an altered state of consciousness or something else like music, a movie, anything external or anything internal, then you're entering into that state perhaps purposefully, but that's a form of hypnosis. I mean, you're basically getting brainwashed, you're getting programmed by that external force. So if you do it purposefully yourself through a guided way, at least you have some semblance, but I usually don't recommend guided forms of entering altered states of consciousness for that reason, because externals are acting on your brain. So then there's an auditory ways to enter these states. And so if you're listening to something, either internally that you're producing or externally you're listening to something and it puts you in an altered state of consciousness, then that's an auditory way of utilizing these techniques. Same thing with visual. If you're watching something that puts you into an altered state of consciousness, or if you are imagining something, then we call that visual. That's a form of meditation as well. And then finally, my favorite way of accessing these states are mindfulness meditation. There's also a kinesthetic component to that, which is like Tai Chi and stuff like that. But I like mindfulness the best because mindfulness is when you observe reality as it is, either in your own body or in the environment, and you're aware of the moment, and you enter an altered state of consciousness, and then you're able to purposefully change the conditioning that's happening to you externally. And I just want to touch on very, very, very quickly on religious versus secular induction techniques. So religious techniques are those that refer to something supernatural or something that hasn't been proven to be true. And secular technique or religious and secular techniques are those techniques that do not refer to anything supernatural or religious. So if we could go to the next slide, Sharon. So purposeful altered states of consciousness equal meditation. So when you enter an altered state of consciousness, you're entering a state of meditation. And, Tara, let's continue to talk about the specific neurotransmitters and how they affect us. And if we could go to the next slide.
Thank you, Mark. There are more neurotransmitters, not just dopamine, that are known to bring us a great amount of happiness, bliss, joy. And another one that's really become, it's misunderstood because the study about endorphins has really exploded over the past just couple of decades. We used to believe that endorphins was a feeling of pleasure, but actually endorphins are a feeling of relief or a reduction of pain. Our endorphins are the natural opioids of our body. So what morphine and heroin and codeine, those things can do for us, those things all are designed to relieve pain. That's what endorphins do naturally. So they don't really clearly give us happiness or bliss. They just reduce enough pain to make us feel elation. there are only a few ways that we can really achieve endorphins. Exercise, laughter, orgasm, those things produce endorphins. But interestingly about endorphins is actually they're too large of a molecule to pass through the blood-brain barrier. So what we've uncovered is, if you'll go to the next slide, is the true bliss molecule, and that is called anandamide. So while endorphins are felt on the opioid receptors, anandamide is experienced through our endocannabinoid system and our cannabinoid receptors. And interestingly, so if you're thinking CBD oil, you're on the right track. CBD oil is known to help to block the breakdown of anandamide, which is the purest form of bliss. But anandamide specifically reacts to our CB1 receptor, the exact same experience as THC from the marijuana plant. So we actually have a homogeneous ability to create anandamides through diet and through habits in our life.
So what I've noticed is that sometimes people do not do what is actually good for them, for their future, for their intrinsic most wants and dreams. But they take what seems like the easy way or maybe the old way of acting out, and they follow paths that give them an external endorphin and anandamide rush rather than better results, or they fail to learn techniques that create endorphins and anandamide internally. And it seems like what this means is that externals, including people and corporations who know how to turn on our endorphins, can get us to do things that we don't really want to do. Have you noticed this, Tara?
There's no doubt about it. Any type of stimulants. And it's not that people aren't willing to. I think a lot of times people see this as willpower. It is simply a lack of knowledge as to what's going on in our brain. And once we understand this and we earn this knowledge, even on a high level, we have just unbelievable, limitless moments, aha moments of how we actually have more power over our choices and our habits. As a matter of fact, Mark, why don't you share with us some of the habits and techniques that really relate to the production of anandamide, the ultimate bliss molecule.
Right on. So if we could go to the next slide. So mindfulness meditation is one of those techniques that help us to override external conditioning. And the reason why I like mindfulness over other techniques is so it doesn't program us with, human-made concepts, especially religious or supernatural concepts. It allows us to utilize the processes of the body to enter an altered state of consciousness. So it asks us it asks you to repetitively return to feeling good with reality as it is. And this sets up neural pathways that release the types of neurotransmitters that make us feel good, but from within. So this is neuroplasticity in action at its best from an internal source. It's not an externals dependent meditation. So as we know, neuroplasticity works through constant repetition. And here with mindfulness, we're combining repetition with altered states of consciousness. This is why it takes a long time to learn to meditate well. But this is also why meditation is the most powerful, positive technique for change that I'm familiar with. And this is why I recommend long 10-day courses and minimally 1-hour meditation sessions to learn to meditate well. So if we could go to the next slide, Sharon. So based on many studies, meditation gives us benefits. The psychological benefits of meditation include decreased stress, depression, decreased dissatisfaction. It serves as a tool for changing unproductive mental patterns. It aids in the treatment of anxiety disorders and addictions, many other benefits. But again, check with your physician. Meditation's not right for everyone. If we could go to the next slide. So we used to think that meditation was a subjective experience only. And we now know that meditation changes the brain physically. More than 20 studies, University of British Columbia, found that on average, practitioners tended to have distinct differences in areas of the brain compared with non-practitioners. So most dramatically, we saw an increase in tissue in the area of the brain that maintains attention and controlling impulses. We saw thicker tissue in the area responsible for attention control and body awareness. We see stronger connections between various brain areas, a reduction in the region linked to negative emotions, sadness and anxiety, and reduced activity in the brain region responsible for pain. So if in the next slide, you're going to see how this looks physically on the brain. These regions of the brain look different in people who meditate regularly. So I think this might indicate that meditation allows us to resist environmental influences which would otherwise program our brain and overcome our free will with external information. We're causing these changes internally through our own will. So now, Tara, let's talk some more about the other neurochemicals.
Okay, thanks, Mark. If we can go to the next slide. You've probably also heard about the neurotransmitter serotonin. And serotonin is similar to what we've shared thus far, but it's got one big difference. Serotonin, as you can see by the slide, it gives us that feeling of pride and confidence and being heard and being validated. But a big difference with serotonin as compared to endorphins, anandamide, and dopamine is those three can be created all on your own by yourself. Serotonin, with the exception of meditation, we need others to create serotonin. When we think about going to our social media and we're looking forward to all those comments, that's dopamine. But when we see those likes and those hearts and those positive comments, that infuses serotonin in our minds and makes us feel confident and proud. The challenge with serotonin is that just like dopamine, it is a very small molecule and it's temporary. It's reduced very easily. That's why medication is so widely used today. I'm sure you've heard of SSRIs. Those help the reuptake of serotonin and keep serotonin coursing through our minds. It takes me back to years and years ago. My friends used to love to come to my house and talk to my mom, because she would take a deep interest in my friends, get to know them, and then she would just flourish the most specific, beautiful compliments onto my friends. And they were crazy about her because she gave them this great infusion of serotonin.
Yeah, and being hooked, being dependent on external serotonin, especially online, is definitely a concern. It was a concern for me. Some of you may have noticed that I haven't been as active online lately for about a year. I wanted to take some time off and see, am I really addicted to serotonin and these chemicals? I mean, I think I'm not, but I might be, because we certainly all know people who are fueled by internet relationships that give them multitudes of cheap and short substitutes for true connections. So I'm still trying to find out. Go ahead, Tara.
And interestingly, Mark, and quite sadly during this quarantine time, this knowledge is more powerful than ever, because this screen is really one of the only ways to connect with other people. So we're really infusing the addiction to dopamine and serotonin. But the good news is there is another neurotransmitter that's more powerful than serotonin, because it can last up to 2 weeks. And not only is it a neurotransmitter, but it also has hormone qualities. And if you'll go to the next slide, I will reveal the queen of neurotransmitters, and that's oxytocin. Now, dopamine gives us that spicy, sexy feeling that we get in the beginning of relationships. That's not oxytocin. Endorphins gives us the feeling when we have orgasm. That's not oxytocin. Oxytocin is something that is the most freeing and the most pleasurable, and it's a feeling of true love and bonding and connection. It's this feeling of trust no matter what. That's why team building became so popular, because when you experience something with people that you're a little bit close to, and you do something that puts you out of your comfort zone and feels risky, you create this bond. It infuses oxytocin, and oxytocin gives us a feeling of freedom. It gives us a feeling of trust. And so the message here is, do all you can to get off that screen And even with the small people that are in your bubble during this quarantine time, make sure you're touching them, make sure that you're telling them how much they mean to you. And this will deliver back to you in a multitude of ways, a more feeling of peace, comfort, and joy. And this is proven through the science of oxytocin.
Right on. So here it seems that we biologically evolved to have deep, real human connection. And this makes sense. Animals survive better when interworking with others. We are better together. We get true gratification from oxytocin. And when we can't find true connections, we get the cheaper and shorter lasting versions from serotonin, dopamine, others. Even if these feelings don't last long and they still need to be constantly repeated, it's better than feeling lonely, right? So these brain chemicals have their utility as they require us to continue to have human contact. And when we have human interaction or we don't have human interaction and it's not available adequately, maybe we substitute it with the internet or with animal contact or other animal contact or something like that. We get short lasting serotonin hits or dopamine hits or whatever. And when true deep relationships develop, we get our oxytocin, which is awesome. So the internet is obviously, though, hijacking now our up till now evolutionary process, and it's rewiring our brains differently. So with the things that we're talking about here help us to gain control back over our brain chemicals.
Absolutely, Mark. The interesting thing that I failed to share is that a lot of folks will say to me, and I would include people close to me, they'll say, well, I don't need so many friends. I don't need these deep connections. I don't need compliments. Science proves that we all need it. But what happens is we're replacing our need for oxytocin with dopamine. And the number one way to mitigate and diminish the addiction to dopamine and serotonin is to elevate oxytocin. So Mark, share with us what you've discovered as how your techniques relate to the elevation and sustainability of oxytocin.
Right on. So people who do not truly understand meditation, and if we could go to, well, we're still on the oxytocin slide now. So if people do not truly understand meditation or have created studies that miss the point of what good meditation techniques actually do, they sometimes make the mistake of thinking that learning meditation makes you not need humans, and thus they've concluded that meditation maybe leads to more antisocial behavior or something like that. What I found is that proper meditation techniques make us a person who is more in tune with other people. Meditation techniques do create oxytocin between people, because when you're a good meditator, especially mindfulness.
Did we lose him?
It looks like we lost him.
You learn to experience a person, especially one that you have a really deep bond, so much better. And proper meditation techniques teach you not to dump your neediness on other people either. So the benefit of meditation is that it does not make you as attached to serotonin and dopamine and other neurochemicals that are produced externally, allow you to produce them themselves, so you're able to be a lot more powerful with those chemicals. Therefore, you're less likely to get hooked on people or other externals who might not be good for you, but you're more likely to enjoy the great relationships that you do have. You'll enjoy people even more knowing how to experience the moment. So without these tools, awareness tends to be more shallow. So Shira, if we could go to the slide now that is, this one that we're on right now, that's perfect. So I hope that we have, what we've shown here is that we are affected by our brain chemicals. I hope that what we've shown here is that what we think is our free will, a lot of times is actually affected by our external environment, which produces chemicals within our own brains, and it makes it look like we're acting internally and we're doing something from within, but we're actually being affected by externals. And I hope that we've also introduced some techniques that you'll research further, such as meditation, such as mindfulness meditation, that can help us change the very physical structures of our neural pathways, and that affect that are not affected by external agents, or that affect other external agents that would otherwise rob us of our free will. So if this is the case, and these techniques continue to be proved effective by peer-reviewed studies, maybe doesn't this show that we might have some semblance of free will, or that we're able to in some way maybe get some of our free will back, right? Maybe. So if we could go to the next slide, and Tara, maybe you could comment on what your thoughts are.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. I just want to close out my years of stimulants like coffee and cigarettes and running from pain. This study really helped me to discover that there are so many ways to have power over our choices, our habits, our behavior, and finally our performance. And interestingly, as it relates to the talk this morning, is that I first discovered changes in diet and the importance of exercise, and then some yoga. And I never really would wrap my arms around meditation. But when I finally realized that that was the one ingredient that I kept reading about, especially as it relates to anandamide and oxytocin, when I really wrapped my arms around that, I was able to diminish my addiction to dopamine and serotonin and find peace in my life and a much elevated performance. So interestingly, that as I was on a much better path, still dealing with the pain of my daughter, another tragedy struck our family. And I remember for 3 weeks after that tragedy, which I'll talk about in my next book, but the response to it is what's important here, is that I sat back on my porch. I told my husband, I want cigarettes. I got back on the cigarettes and coffee for about 3 weeks, and I was barely functioning again, just doing my job and coming home. And then I was sitting on my porch one afternoon, and it hit me. I said to myself, I know this feeling. I know this pain. I know this feeling of being helpless, and I know exactly what to do about it. And I threw the cigarettes away, minimized the coffee. And as a matter of fact, the very next day I had a huge speech to give, and my associate was ready to go on the stage for me. And I grabbed that microphone from him, and we still talk about this moment. And I said, give me that blippity blip mic. And I gave one of the best talks of my lifetime. And that is so much thanks to this study, and especially the infusion of meditation. So I hope this has been helpful to you all, and I hope it's been inspiring to take more control over your brain chemicals. And I'll turn it back over to Mark to share how you can learn more.
Right on. Thank you so much, Tara. That's awesome. So what do you think? We know that external forces shape who we are. We know that they cut short our free will and force us to act, right? Do you think we have a weapon here? If these techniques give us the ability to override our biological, environmental conditioning, does this mean that we might have some semblance of free will? And in the next slide, I'm going to let Tara touch on this for a second. We're building a neurotransmitter quiz. And so please contact us through the address on the next slide that we're creating. And we're creating an email list that will keep you in the loop on our latest work. Basically, what questions do you have about neurotransmitters and the techniques that we've talked about? Tara can answer those questions, and I'll answer about meditation.
I think we might have missed the contact slide. Maybe... There we go. Okay, thank you so much. We've built an assessment that we're just about ready to share, and it will help you to really analyze your behaviors and your choices and what really might be guiding them. So I encourage each of you to send us a note through this On Point Global, and that is a FrenchSpelling.com/contact, and we can share our writings as well as this assessment with you when you're ready. And I'll turn it back over to Mark.
Thank you, Tara. And I'll turn it back over to Angie or Shara, or questions or whatever you guys want to talk about next.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Tara. So there's no doubt that many people do derive great satisfaction from meditation and other relaxation activities. But I had some problems with some of the things. I'd like you to define for me what you mean by free will, because you're saying that that you don't have the free will, but then this gives it to you. I don't really understand what you mean.
Yeah, great question, Angie. So basically, first of all, I think when we practice meditation just to relieve ourselves of stress, that's not the purpose that I'm talking about here. I'm talking about rewiring the brain through neuroplasticity, so that we can change our mental patterns from a neuro point of view, in a neuro way. And so I don't know if this answers the question, but basically, does that answer the question?
Well, I don't know. I think you're throwing a bunch of terms in there that I need definitions for. When you
Okay,
talk about
pretty good.
rewiring the brain, I don't know if you're talking about sort of reprogramming your responses to stimulus versus actual physical changes in the brain, because you're conflating the two on in many of the statements that you've made, and I really need to understand what you mean by those things.
Yeah, I think it's both. So you asked me about free will, and I'll touch base on that again. So to me, the way I define free will is when our body, our brain, makes a decision to do something, and it's not forced by some external suggestion. Okay. So let's say that.
Wait, I'm sorry. I'm already having problems because your response to whatever external, when you keep saying externals, and what I think of when you say external dopamine or external transmitters means that someone has injected it into my vein, or I've taken a pill,
yeah.
And so that's I understand that I'm kind of understanding you to mean that you're physical, that you're responding to external stimuli, which we really don't have a lot of control over, but we absolutely have some control over our responses to that external stimuli. So I think I'm just getting confused on the terminology.
Right on. So let's imagine that we're watching a commercial. We've all seen certain commercials that drove us crazy, that we thought this product sucks, I'll never use it, I don't like this commercial. But over time it kind of seeps into us, and we wind up buying the product. So what that product probably did, what that commercial probably did, is it turned on some of our neurochemicals. And Tara can give us some examples of how these neurochemicals are turned on. And so what happens when these neurochemicals are turned on, they give us certain sensations that we react to internally. So in that way, our free will is cut short by external agents. And this includes, this is done by commercials, but it can also be done by other people, by corporations, by messages that we get from our environment. So what meditation does is it allows you to basically learn how to notice that these chemicals are being turned on. The whole concept of mindfulness is about being mindful of what's happening in your brain in relation to the external environment. And I know I'm defining it or explaining it in a different way than that's commonly shown. But that's because I've practiced it for so many years, and I feel like that's a justified way of explaining it. So when we're exercising techniques such as mindfulness meditation, and we receive impetus from the external environment, we get a few more extra seconds and the ability to kind of watch what these chemicals are doing to our brain, and therefore we're taking back our mental processes. And yes, these mental processes are internal, and what studies have shown, and I can send you some links to the studies and everything, is that the brain, the neural pathways in the brain do change physically. Our brain changes physically through neuroplasticity, depending on how we use it. And meditation is one way to use it that helps us change the brain physically. Tara, do you have anything to add to this?
I can totally understand the discomfort with the word free will, when I think really what we're talking about is some of our environments certainly we cannot affect. But we can choose, if we have an hour in the evening, we can choose to watch Netflix or scroll through Facebook, or we can choose to meditate or exercise or connect with somebody that we love. And that empowers us. And that gives us control of our behavior.
Yeah, that's actually a really very good point. And that was exactly the point. I mean, like, no doubt, 100%. When you feel like you're more in control of your responses, when you feel like you're in control of situations, just like with you putting aside whatever you felt like you were using instead of taking control, that sounds like it was absolutely an adaptive response, and it made you feel better. And when that happens, your stress hormones definitely will go down. So I'm glad you had that experience, that you felt like you were able to take control in that situation. That's good. That's a good thing. We do have a couple of questions. What is the role of 5-hydroxytryptamine in meditation?
I am not familiar with that. I wish we could ask the person asking the question, more about what they want to know about that. But I'm not familiar with that aspect of it.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see here. There was a comment about...
And maybe Tara, are you familiar with this chemical?
Sorry, no.
Yeah, that's the chemical name for serotonin. So,
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming and seeing us today. We really appreciate it. I certainly hope people do get relaxation however they feel they need to. I am a doctor, and it's fine to have relaxation in just about everyone. I can't think of any medical conditions that would preclude someone from performing meditation if they so chose. Certainly if there are positions involved, that might be uncomfortable or not possible, but it sounds like there's certainly some form of meditation that people could do if they find that helps them very much. Thank you so much for coming to see us today. We really appreciate your coming. And thank you for watching our Skeptrack live stream from Dragoncon 2020. We hope you'll join us for later talks. Thank you. Keep safe, please. Social distance. Wear your mask. Wash your hands. We'll see you later. Bye, y'all.
Thank you. Bye.
As fun as all this streaming content is, we sincerely cannot wait to see you all in person again next year. Remember to stay healthy and safe until then. Wear a mask when interacting with other people out in the real world. Want more Skeptrack? Get more than 10 years of Skeptics track programming at our video archive, video.skeptrack.org.